Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja. And what follows this introduction is a webinar that I had conducted previously, a live webinar, and I thought I should edit it and make it available to a wider audience. So without further ado, here is an edited webinar, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Now in chapter 2 or part 2, now remember that this is one of the most important parts in terms of the plot, but also in terms of what is said here. But as we know that by the end of part 1, Marlowe has reached on the central station, right? And he's been told that the boat is in disrepair, so he has to fix the boat. He also gives us opinions about, different characters on the station, including the station manager, who is a formidable figure. So Leah, let me put you in. Okay. Your name here is not listed at Leah, but I guess that's what you go by. All right, so that's roughly the plot. Now, this section is also important. This is where you get the most descriptions of the darkness of Africa, and it is also literally a move into the interiors, right? So he gets the boat fixed, but there is an important conversation that he overhears that I had mentioned. Between the manager and and that's what I'm going to make your journal about. Maybe I missed it. Maybe it was in the first section. But what happens is he's working on the boat and he's, sleeping in the boat. And the manager and his uncle is leading the El Dorado expedition. These are prospectors out in Africa to get the wealth. And the uncle is telling his nephew is that you are the one who will win this. What will he win? Maybe a higher position in the organization. Not because he's the most productive or the most visionary, but he has a lasting quality. We have been told by Marlowe that this manager guy didn't have a sense of humor, but one thing that was in his favor was that he was indestructible. The local diseases didn't affect him. His health was fine. And towards the end of that conversation, the uncle points out to the forest, right? And he says, take care of it, your competition. So, of course, the competition is Kurtz, who is being raised to be a leader in the company and who is the most productive, right? So this quest of the boat then is to go and retrieve Kurtz. That's what they are doing. But in this part also, we get most of the imagery of Africa and Africans, both close at hand, right? As he describes the people who are working with him. This is also the only part in which we hear two African characters speak, right? And we already talked about it. And they are represented as cannibals, right? And there's a whole passage where Marlowe kind of speculates. It's like, if they are starving and hungry, why don't they eat us, right? What restrains them, right? And so that is a big question in colonialism too, is how do the colonizers incorporate these large populations into their own project, right? And a lot of people try to essentialize it. The racists here in America would tell you, the brown people are like that and black people are like that because it makes sense to them, right? But the reason so many of these systems succeed is because the natives are looking at it from their own perspective, from their own cosmologies, right? So, for example, the Inca Empire, the conquistadores were able to conquer it because there was a prophecy. in their religion that gods will come down from the ocean, so many in number. They will have golden hair. So when the king of Incas is interacting with these people who are brutal, and they are learning in the process that these aren't gods, these are brutal thugs, right? His own clergy is telling him this is not who they are. But he's like, no, it's in our prophecy. So sometimes a very elaborate system can predispose you to accepting authority, your own belief system. But also, in every situation, the colonizers played one group against the other. So here, most of the times, the guards are from Zanzibar, right? Those were mercenaries, warrior groups, right? So who got incorporated into the project of empire? Because, they could sell their services and, make a living. Similarly here, we don't know if these people are cannibals or not, but that's what they are represented as a specific tribe. So there is no monolithic African identity. There are conflicts amongst those communities as well. And what colonialism does is it further subjectivizes those experiences because it starts using one group against the other. And the long-term impact of that is, of course, that long after the colonizers leave, those communal differences, communal prejudices still exist, right? And that's what we could read this as an example of as well. Okay, then please do pay special attention to how he describes going up the river. These are some of the passages that are highly cited in Conrad scholarship. So like the passage, going up that river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted on earth and the big trees were kings, an empty stream, a great silence, an impenetrable forest. Okay, now also think of it. The only difference between London and this place is that, London the river Thames has been tamed, made navigable, whereas he's traveling in a wild river and it's forested, right? But because of that geography, what Conrad or Marlowe can then impose on that thing is not necessarily only that this is not civilized compared to where we came from, but that it exists in prehistoric times. So thus, by extension, people who live there, they are also considered the prehistoric men, right? And that is a colonial way of looking at native cultures or African cultures, even though we know, and as you read Achebe, you will find out that these weren't just wild people running around in the jungle. They had a culture. They had built great cities, Timbuktu and others. They had built empires, right? And they had a body of law, but they had different customs of war. They had different customs of peace. Some of them good, some of them maybe terrible, right? But the Europeans themselves had the same thing. These are the same people. Remember, this journey is being done in 1890, right? 50 years ago, these were the very same people, Europeans, who called themselves civilized, who were capturing African people in the jungle, right? And transporting them in slave ships as a commodity to sell. Right? They are not so far away. And that's the beauty of colonialism, is that they can do the most atrocious things, but still consider themselves civilized. But that's also coming across in this section. But the whole idea of he penetrating deeper and deeper into the jungle, right? In the boat to retrieve kurtz. And like, for example, this passage, the prehistoric man was cursing us, praying to us, welcoming us. Who could tell? We were cut off from the comprehension of our surroundings. We glided past like phantoms, wondering and secretly appalled, as sane men would be before an enthusiastic outbreak in a madhouse, right? So there are references to this, is that this entry into wilderness is also doing something to these people, right? And so that then brings, and there are quite a few passages here where you see that brings to fore this idea of so is the madness in Africa, or is it the weaknesses of these people who are coming to Africa, that they cannot sustain the difference, right, in lifestyle, in the psychological impact? So do they bring the madness with them? Is it a weak constitution they have? Or is it the land itself? I think Marlowe leaves it ambivalent, right? Leaves it ambivalent because what it focuses on is that if you let go of the little pieces, shreds upon which your integrity is built, then you will go crazy. And that's why when he finds that book, right, when they go and they find this shed where wood has been laid out for them, firewood, and he looks at that book and annotations which he thinks are in cipher, but they're actually in Russian. But at the first glance, you could see there a singleness of intention, an honest concern for the right way of going to work, which made these humble pages thought out so many years ago luminous with another than a professional light. Such a book being there was wonderful enough, but still more astounding were the notes penciled in the margin, right? So what he's saying is that this simple activity of reading a book, putting notes on it, maybe is a reminder to this European person of where he or she came from, and thus they may not go crazy, right? And then he gives, there are different references to the police, to the structures of civilization from which these people came, right? And so the idea is, if you take away those structures that keep us civilized through shaming, through law, and throw us into the wild, right? Chances are then, we'll either go crazy or we'll become insane and power hungry, right? So in my reading of it, there is room here to read that what Marlowe is saying is that people who stop being restrained by their own moral code or legal code are the one more likely to take it into their heads that they are the masters and they have the guns, right? And these natives are nobodies if they just treat them as instruments. Those are the people. So in a way, then we could argue that they are bringing this madness with them because their identities are so thinly constructed that there is no substance to it, right? Because there are no legal frameworks or a civic society to keep them in check. These men, when they get into the jungle, they're already there for greed, right? There is nothing sustaining them. So what keeps us decent maybe is the civic structure in which we exist, right? And you can take that thought and apply it anywhere, right? What is permissible in a given culture, in a given public sphere, decides what we can say or what we can do, right? You take it away, give these people freedom to say things, tweak the structure a little more, things that were otherwise not permissible suddenly become permissible, and these people think that it's their right to say things, or things like that. So that's what I'm also reading into this. I'm not seeing your comments yet, but so the section then, towards the end of the section, they get attacked. But there is foreshadowing. He already tells us about Kurtz, right? And that he had written a book because the book was commissioned, and the book was about how to control the native tribes, right? Which is kind of a dig at the studies that were written by a lot of European travelers and all, and they would always assume the natives as this, monolithic group, associate certain things with them, and then we'll try to come up with the systems of controlling them. So that I read it as a satire of that kind of writing. But There are a few good lines here. This was because the original Kurtz had been educated partly in England. So as he was good enough to say himself, his sympathies were in the right place. Right? His mother was half English. His father was half French. All Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. So that's a really interesting suggestion. Now, is he just referring to his lineage? But is it the system that Europeans created? Kurtz was an outcome of that colonial system. So maybe he can stand for one kind of colonial subjectivity. And by, I learned that most appropriately, the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs, that's a made-up name, had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance. And he had written it too. I've seen it. I've read it. It was eloquent, vibrating with eloquence, but too high-strung, I think. 17 pages of close writing. He had found time for it. But this must have been before his, let us say, nerves went wrong and caused him to preside at certain midnight dances, ending with unspeakable rites. Right? So, and the last line of that document is exterminate the brutes, right? So Kurtz is not just there to extract ivory, he's also there to write a report about how to control the native tribes, right? When the manager and his uncle are talking, do they know that Kurtz has gone crazy and they probably don't know, but they think that something is up. And they know that he's probably ill, right? So that's why the rivets were not arriving. We can construe from that the manager was trying to delay the rescue. And their hope is that Kurtz will not survive it because Kurtz is competition. That's why if you reread that conversation carefully, you will see that the uncle is trying to convince the manager that, look, you are the guy because you can outlast all of these people. And our only competition is him, right? And so I read that as these two already knowing that maybe Kurtz is not going to survive, but they don't really know exactly what he has been up to over there. Primitive, however, he admits that they might be similar to Europeans. Does this redeem Marlowe and Conrad himself from being a complete racist? Well, that's a really good question because he calls them prehistoric men, but what there is a sentence here where he also acknowledges that the most uncanny thing about it was that when you looked in your eyes, you realized that they were equally as human as you. Now, my former professor, who was a Conrad scholar, had written an article using that line, right? And he and Chinua Achebe had back and forth letter correspondence at that time. And he wrote to Achebe and he said, look, here is what he says, And Achebe then writes him back one paragraph and he says, what is the next line? And the next line is, but ugly, right? That, yeah, they were human, but they were ugly, right? And he's like, how can you reconcile the two? So yeah, there is a grudging acceptance of the humanity of the natives, right? But that humanity is always accepted in a past connection. But the European self, what Marlowe is saying is, these could be our ancestors, right? They live in the same time with them. That is what we call allocronic discourse. When the European puts the global other or the native in a different time zone, even though they're interacting at the same time, right? So whatever humanity is attributed to Africans is done grudgingly, but also it is attributed in a different time zone, that they are prehistoric still. They haven't reached the level of the European consciousness. And so, I don't know, for me, the novel is more complex than just being racist or not racist. But then that's my reading. When we go and read Achebe's speech on it, he has a point, and he argues very strongly for that. So we'll see what we think about it. Does Marlowe say that women must stay in the beautiful world of their own as if they exist in? Well, that's, some of it is very ironic. Like what he's assuming here, and remember, this is kind of Victorian England, that they must keep the women protected from the knowledge of the world. So telling them that I am going to go and civilize and bring civilization there, but not actually telling them the gritty detail of it, is what he thinks would be more gentlemanlike. Now keep that in mind, because when he goes and meets, what we also get the hint is that Kurtz hasn't told his fiancée as to what he does in Africa, right? And then when Marlowe goes and meets her after Kurtz's death, Marlowe also totally lies to her. You know, we know that the last words of Kurtz were the horror, the horror. And Marlowe tells her that no, he mentioned you when he was dying. So this paternalistic attitude, you know, part of it is the paternalism of its time, thinking that women need to be protected from the world, they need to be protected from reality. But part of it is Marlowe also being a bit facetious. If you read it carefully, you will see that. So why were the Europeans so eager to call the natives cannibals when the natives were helping the ship travel through the Congo? Well, I mean, I don't know. There used to be a few, not cannibalistic tribes, but some tribes had a custom that where if an elder died, you know, the people would consume part of his flesh, but you can only understand it within the rituals of religion. In most African religions like Shango and others, what happens is when the elders die, they don't just go to heaven. There is a space between the gods and the village which is filled with the spirits of the ancestors. That's why so much of emphasis is on keeping the ancestral spirits happy, because they mediate between the people and gods. But for Europeans, it was easy. Look, there are certain things the Europeans use to justify their aggression. In Africa, it was cannibalism, right? Because if you could say, oh, these people eat their own dead, well, we must conquer them and teach them it is wrong, right? In India, the first law that the British promulgated was against the widow sacrifice, against sati. Now, sati was a very rarely performed ritual only in some high families, right? But what the British represented it as if it's happening rampantly everywhere. It was in fiction, it was in romances, because the idea was, and this is a line from Gayatri Spivak's work, because what they wanted to create was a narrative of white men saving brown women from brown men, right? And that idea would sell, right? These people do this to their women, so let's go conquer them and teach them our ways. We are still using that. We used it in Afghanistan, we used it in Iraq. Now and that makes it easier to ideologically underwrite a colonial enterprise, but also to raise funds for it. You know, if you're a mission, Christian mission, and it's like, yeah, give us the money, we want to bring the Bible to these people. Marlowe seems to admire the patience of the cannibals, and it seems like it is one of the few qualities he thinks is better than, I don't know if he thinks it is better than Europeans, but what he's saying is, well, if restraint is one of our qualities, which we admire, then these guys have the absolute restraint. Those are some really moving passages, because their hippo meat has run out and has been thrown off the boat because the pilgrims can't sustain the smell of it, and they haven't eaten much. They just eat a little bit of what they've brought with them. And what he's saying is, what kind of noble restraint it is that they don't kill us and eat us, right? And that he seems to admire. He also admires his helmsman when he dies. I mean, even though he uses racist terms for him, but he said, look, he made something of himself. He wasn't a good helmsman, but he learned how to steer a boat. Oh, that is an acknowledgement that, Africans, remember we talked about the Bergsonian model of looking at natives and Hegelian. So this is kind of thinking, oh, maybe we can teach them to be like us, or maybe we can teach them to be useful. Now remember, these are people who know their own skills, right? They built their own cities. They know how to use tools. They have vocabularies, language, art. But that doesn't come across to Marlowe or to any European reading these customs. I don't think so if he would consider himself Kurtz's successor, because he's not there for the same purpose as Kurtz. Kurtz is there to collect ivory and be a successful agent. Marlowe is there to be a boat captain. But he does, I would say he does admire something about Kurtz, right? But also he uses Kurtz as a cautionary tale, right? What can go wrong if, remember what goes wrong with Kurtz, and we'll read it more carefully, is that he goes native, right? The Africans adopt him, but he becomes part of their life. But he doesn't take up the persona of, a doctor or a guy who's going to learn the languages. He tries to become a god, right? And that's the ultimate form of bravery. Now, there are instances in colonial situations where the soldiers do take up the role of becoming a king. I mean, when the United States invaded Haiti before the First World War, I think 1913 US invasion of Haiti, it was the first time Marine Corps was deployed as president troops. Now, they had gone there to secure Citibank's loans. Okay, that's always sometimes the reason. But there were instances where Marines, with a few troops, right, they had gone into the interior of Haiti and declared themselves kings. There was one who was called King Jones, right? And then they came and wrote the accounts of it. Some of it was made into plays. So that tendency does exist. But in modern times, it's represented differently. Like sometimes it can be 3 soldiers who go AWOL and then find a treasure and sell it and become rich. But the idea is the same. We are in Iraq. If we can get away with it, our rules don't apply to it. This is for us to plunder, right? Even though they are part of a very organized military organization. So we also have seen Vietnam movies in which things like that happen. Okay, so Kurtz is admired somewhat by other characters, but by and large, as I read it, Kurtz at best is a cautionary tale, right? A cautionary tale is in the terms that this is what can happen to you if you forget where you came from, or if you go fully native, or if you let your desire to extract. Remember, there is a passage where Marlowe says to him, everything was for him. Okay? My ivory, my land, my this, my that. So this is a person who has reached that level of delusion that everything he touches or thinks or talks about is his. And it's that level of greed, right, and delusional attitude that would drive you crazy, right? So I see Kurtz as a cautionary tale, even though for so many people on the way, he is this legendary figure. But in order to understand that, we don't have to associate those with Conrad's views. Who is praising him, right? Same people who want to succeed at their jobs as being, prospectors for ivory. These are the same people in whose logic the most successful person is the one who collects the most ivory and is respected the most. These are commission agents, right? So think of it the same way. If you work for a departmental store, right, and every week one person is declared employee of the week, and that is based on the number of sales that that person does, then that is the medium through which your success will be measured, right? Who sold the most phones and who sold the most lipsticks, right? And so if that person becomes apotheosized or whatever, it's within the logic of that structure of selling, right? So you can't like say, oh, well, that person is kinder and gentler and writes good poetry, and it's like that doesn't apply. So whatever praise of Kurtz we see is from the very people who are committed to that system within which Kurtz is a legendary figure, right? So we shouldn't probably read it as Conrad's views. Conrad is, after all, creating these characters through which. So this concludes this edited version of the webinar. I hope it was useful to you. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to send them my way, and I'll try to address them and answer them. I will keep posting more such materials both on the YouTube channel as well as on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today, and as always, take care and peace and love.